Now we'll look over the parts of the sewing machine from the top to the bottom. Up the top here you can see we've got several bits that are sticking up in the air, and we've also got a handle. That's just for carrying the machine when you need to relocate it to another place. I'll point out that a lot of machines will have these different bits in different places. They might look slightly different, but they all do the same basic thing. So although your machine might differ to mine, you will still find these tutorials helpful. So let's start right over in the right hand corner where we've got this biggest bit sticking up. That is where I sit my spool of thread for threading up the machine. Over here we've got a little bobbin holder. These are the bobbins that you will get with your machine, and you can also buy extra ones. They're not always plastic, it just depends on your machine. And they are what we also wind thread onto, but I'll explain that afterwards. That's just a place you can sit an extra one. And this right here, you can also place a bobbin on when you need to wind up the thread. But we'll be looking at how to do that separately. Now if we come over here, this little round part here is a place that we can put our thread around when we're threading the machine. And then the same with these two sections right here, they are for threading, and we'll be looking at how to thread the machine in a moment. Moving down to the side of the machine from the top, this is my right hand side. I have this dial here, and that helps me to move my needle up and down. And it also repositions the little threading parts at the top. And then we have the on and off button, which is as simple as that. There's a vent here, and of course my cord. One part of the cord goes to the power source, and the other part goes to my treadle for actually operating the machine. Now at the front of the machine at the top, we have some dials and some options. So here we have a tension dial, and that's going to adjust how tightly the thread feeds through all of these threading mechanisms. And that's going to depend on the project that you're working on. We'll discuss that in more depth. This one right here, this is one that you would use frequently because this is the stitch selector. So on A, that means that I have a straight stitch. And I know that because, well, obviously because I've used this machine so very often, but also because it will be in your manual, and also they have printed it on the front of the machine over here. So A I can see is a straight stitch, so this is sort of my quick reference. Then the BC, that's the other stitch that I use frequently, and that is a zigzag. And it also changes the needle position when I actually move that. So you can use it as a straight stitch with changing the needle position, or you can use it as a zigzag stitch. So going back to A, this one gives the stitch length. So for most sewing, I have mine on, it's sort of towards the 3, I'd say it's towards 2.5 to 3. You can experiment with that and see what sort of length of stitches that you want, but I find for most things really, but especially for garment making, a 2.5 to 3 is the longest kind of stitch that you would want. You wouldn't want it longer than that, and you don't need to have it shorter than that, or you'll have these tiny, tiny little stitches. The stitch width, this comes into play when I select zigzag, so let's do that. I want a zigzag, and I want to say how big my zigzags or how wide my zigzags are going to be, and I usually set it at around 3 for my zigzags. But again, that's something that you can experiment with. It depends whether you want tight little zigzags or looser, further apart zigzag stitches. For normal straight stitching, I will just have this on 0. I will keep this one on between 2.5 and 3, and I will keep this dial on A for straight stitching. Heading further down, we have the stitch plate here. This has a bunch of measurements on it. If you like to be precise with your measurements, that can be really handy for lining up your seams and that kind of thing. I tend not to use those so much. I'm a bit of an eyeballer when it comes to sewing. And of course, this is where our needle, eventually the thread comes down through the needle threader and into this needle. And then I can use the dial at the side of the machine to put the needle up and down. And as I showed you before, I can also use the stitch width to move the needle from side to side. Now, at the very bottom, we have this compartment that actually comes off, and it comes off for a good reason, because although we thread the machine from the top, that's for the top stitch, we also need to thread it from the bottom so that we get a bottom stitch. So on my machine, because mine is such a simple machine, this part right here just folds down, and it's a little storage compartment. Let's have a look at that. In the storage compartment, I keep spare bobbins on their little places here. They're especially for the bobbins. And then in this part that's a bit larger, I keep things like spare needles. I keep the different tools or feet that you can use for the machine. So at the moment it's got just a regular foot on it, but you can also detach that and use other feet. This, for example, is a buttonhole stitcher. This one is a clear foot stitcher if you need that extra visibility, and this one is a zipper foot. So they all have different functions that you might use at different times. Definitely the one I use the most is just the everyday ordinary foot. So that's where you can keep extra stuff down there. It's very handy to keep it all in one place, and it just snaps shut. So when I'm stitching on a larger item, maybe I'm hemming a tea towel or something, I would keep this in place because it helps me to guide the fabric. It gives me a bigger surface area. But when I'm stitching, say if I was stitching the hemming around this sleeve, and you see it's a very small opening really, then I would be pulling this off. That comes off very easily, and then I can actually pop the sleeve or the smaller item around there and feed it around that part. So now that we've got that compartment off, I can show you the next essential part to threading your machine, and that is the bobbin. So in this little compartment here is my bobbin case. You can see it right there, and these will look different for a bunch of different machines. Just follow your manual if yours is quite different to mine. And as I said before, this is what allows us to do that underneath stitch. The bobbin case comes out easily. For me, I just pull it out with this little lever that comes up and down. And then on the inside, when I actually thread the machine properly, I'll go through this step thoroughly. But remember the little plastic bobbin that I showed you at the start? That's designed to fit inside the bobbin case. Make sure you've got the right size bobbins for your case. And then I can thread the thread through there. It looks like a little helmet, doesn't it? It's kind of cute. And then that fits back into that spot, usually just clicks in. And then we complete the threading, which I will show you next. One more thing I do want to show you before we move on to threading is this is the reverse button. And so when you are beginning and ending a row of stitching, it's going to come out if you don't secure it somehow, and that is the reverse button. So that just presses down, and that will make your stitching go backwards, and press it up and it goes forwards again. Very simple. There are more things that I could show you, but I want to keep it fairly basic and keep it about you getting up and sewing on your machine. So if you want more detail, make sure you check your manual.